The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street in Tucson, Arizona, when 91-year-old Harold Hank Mitchell stepped out of his modest ranch-style home. The Korean War veteran moved slowly, but with purpose, his weathered hands gripping a wooden cane that had become his constant companion in recent years. His silver hair was neatly combed, and despite his age, his blue eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had served him well during his 3 tours of duty overseas. Hank had lived in the same neighborhood for 47 years, watching children grow up, families move in and out, and the community evolve around him. He was known by everyone on Maple Street as the friendly old man who always waved from his front porch and kept his yard immaculate. His small American flag flew proudly beside his front door, replaced faithfully every Veterans Day by his grandson who lived across town. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Hank had his coffee black, read the newspaper cover to cover, and decided to take his daily walk to the corner market. It was something he had done almost every day for the past decade, a simple routine that kept him active and connected to his community. The doctors had told him that staying mobile was crucial at his age, and Hank took their advice seriously. As he made his way down the sidewalk, neighbors called out their usual greetings. Mrs. Patterson from next door waved from her garden, and the young mother across the street smiled as she loaded her toddler into the car. Everything seemed perfectly normal in this peaceful corner of America where nothing exciting ever happened. But unknown to Hank and his neighbors, a series of events was already in motion that would turn this ordinary Tuesday into a day that would shock the entire nation. 3 blocks away, a police dispatcher had received a call about a suspicious elderly man with a weapon walking through the neighborhood. The caller, later identified as someone new to the area who didn't recognize the local residents, claimed to have seen an old man carrying what looked like a stick or club while acting strangely. Officer Ryan Torres, a relatively new member of the Tucson Police Department with just 18 months on the force, received the call over his radio. The 26-year-old officer had joined the police force with genuine intentions of serving his community, but his training had emphasized treating every call as potentially dangerous. The words "man with weapon" immediately put him on high alert. As Torres drove toward the reported location, his mind raced through the tactical procedures he had learned at the academy. He had been involved in several tense situations during his short career, and his supervisors had praised him for his quick response times and adherence to protocol. However, he had also received feedback about being overly cautious in some situations, criticism that had made him more eager to prove himself as a decisive officer. Meanwhile, Hank continued his leisurely walk, completely unaware that he had been reported as a potential threat. He paused at the corner to let a car pass, tipping his baseball cap to the driver in his characteristic polite manner. His cane tapped rhythmically against the sidewalk as he continued toward the market, where he planned to buy a newspaper and maybe chat with Frank, the store owner who always asked about his health and shared stories about his own father who had served in World War II. The distance between Officer Torres and Hank was closing rapidly, and with it, the gap between a peaceful morning and a confrontation that would change everything. Torres pulled his patrol car around the corner onto Maple Street, his eyes scanning for the reported suspicious individual. His radio crackled with updates from dispatch, reminding him to approach with caution and be prepared for any scenario. As the police car approached, several neighbors noticed and felt a flutter of concern. In their quiet neighborhood, police presence was unusual and typically meant something was wrong. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her flowers, a worried expression crossing her face as she watched the patrol car slow down near where Hank was walking. Hank himself noticed the police car, but thought nothing of it initially. In his experience, police officers were public servants who deserved respect, and he had always had positive interactions with law enforcement throughout his life. He had even considered joining the police force himself after returning from Korea, before ultimately choosing a career in education that spanned 35 years as a high school history teacher. But as the patrol car pulled alongside him and stopped, Hank sensed something was different about this encounter. Officer Torres stepped out of his vehicle with his hand resting on his service weapon, his posture tense and ready for action. The young officer's eyes were focused intently on Hank's cane, which he had identified as the potential weapon mentioned in the dispatch call. The two men faced each other on the sidewalk, separated by decades of life experience and vastly different perspectives on what was happening in that moment. Hank, with his lifetime of service to country and community, saw a young officer who might need assistance or information. Torres, with his recent training emphasizing officer safety and threat assessment, saw an elderly man who had been reported as potentially dangerous and was carrying what could be used as a weapon. Neither man could have predicted what would happen in the next 6 minutes, or how their brief encounter would set in motion a chain of events that would reach far beyond their quiet neighborhood. The morning sun continued to shine down on Maple Street, but the peaceful atmosphere was about to be shattered in a way that would send shockwaves through the veteran community, law enforcement agencies, and military families across the entire country. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the bonds of brotherhood forged in military service, challenge the relationship between police and the communities they serve, and demonstrate the power of loyalty among those who have sworn to protect and defend their fellow Americans. Officer Torres approached Hank with his training protocols running through his mind like a checklist. The dispatcher's warning about a potentially armed individual echoed in his ears as he observed the elderly man's movements carefully. Hank, for his part, straightened his shoulders and prepared to be helpful, assuming the officer might be looking for directions or information about the neighborhood. "Excuse me, sir," Torres called out, his voice carrying the authority he had been taught to project. "I need you to stop right there and keep your hands where I can see them." The command caught Hank completely off guard. In his 91 years, no police officer had ever spoken to him in such a manner, and confusion clouded his weathered features. Hank slowly turned to face the officer fully, his cane shifting in his grip as he maintained his balance. "Is everything all right, officer?" he asked in the polite tone he had used with authority figures throughout his life. "I'm just heading to the corner market like I do every morning. Is there some kind of problem in the neighborhood?" Torres noticed the movement of the cane and felt his pulse quicken. His training had emphasized that weapons could be disguised as everyday objects, and elderly suspects could be just as dangerous as younger ones. The fact that Hank seemed calm didn't necessarily mean he wasn't a threat. "Sir, I'm going to need you to put down whatever you're holding and place your hands on your head," Torres commanded, his voice growing more stern. The request baffled Hank completely. He looked down at his cane, then back at the young officer, trying to understand what was happening. "Officer, this is my walking stick," he explained patiently, holding it up slightly to show it clearly. "I need it to get around. I have arthritis in my knees from an old war injury." He hoped that mentioning his military service might help clarify the misunderstanding. But Torres interpreted Hank's movement of raising the cane as a potential threatening gesture. His hand moved closer to his service weapon as he took a step back. "Drop it now," he shouted, his voice carrying across the quiet street, and causing several neighbors to look out their windows and doors. "I'm not going to ask you again." Mrs. Patterson, who had been watching the interaction with growing alarm, stepped out onto her front porch. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. Hank Mitchell, the gentle man who helped her carry groceries and always had a kind word for everyone, was being treated like a criminal. She wanted to call out and explain to the officer that he was making a mistake, but something in Torres's aggressive posture made her hesitate. Hank's confusion was turning to concern as he realized this wasn't a simple misunderstanding that could be easily cleared up. The officer seemed genuinely agitated, and Hank's decades of experience reading people told him the situation was becoming dangerous. "Officer, I think there's been some kind of mistake," he said, his voice remaining calm despite his growing worry. "I'm Harold Mitchell. I live right there in the Blue House. I'm a Korean War veteran, and I've never been in trouble with the law in my entire life." Torres heard the words, but his training had taught him that criminals often tried to manipulate officers with sob stories and false identities. The mention of military service didn't automatically make someone trustworthy, and plenty of people lied about their backgrounds when confronted by police. What he saw was an elderly man who was not immediately complying with direct orders and who was still holding what could potentially be used as a weapon. The situation was escalating beyond what either man had anticipated. Hank, despite his age and confusion, was still a proud man who had never backed down from a challenge of his life. Having served his country with honor and lived as a law-abiding citizen for 9 decades, he couldn't understand why he was being treated like a common criminal. His military training, dormant for decades, but never forgotten, began to surface as his mind processed what he perceived as an unjust confrontation. Torres, meanwhile, was feeling the pressure of making split-second decisions that his academy instructors had warned him about. The neighborhood was quiet, backup was minutes away, and he was facing a subject who was not immediately complying with lawful orders. Every scenario he had trained for emphasized the importance of maintaining control of the situation and ensuring officer safety above all else. The cane that had been Hank's faithful companion for years had now become the focal point of a dangerous misunderstanding. To Hank, it was simply a medical necessity that allowed him to maintain his independence and dignity. To Torres, it represented a potential weapon in the hands of someone who had been reported as acting suspiciously and who was not following police commands. Other neighbors were now aware that something unusual was happening on their normally peaceful street. David Chun, who lived 2 houses down from Hank, stepped onto his front porch and immediately recognized the absurdity of the situation. He had known Hank for over a decade and had never seen the old veteran so much as raise his voice, let alone pose any kind of threat to anyone. But before any of the neighbors could intervene or explain the situation, Torres made a decision that would change everything. Interpreting Hank's continued possession of his cane and his attempts to explain himself as defiance of lawful orders, the officer reached for his taser. In his mind, he was choosing the least lethal option to subdue a potentially dangerous subject who was refusing to comply. "This is your final warning," Torres shouted, drawing his taser and pointing it at Hank. "Drop the weapon and get on the ground, or I will tase you." The bright yellow and black device gleamed in the morning sunlight, its laser sight creating a small red that danced across Hank's chest. Hank stared at the taser in disbelief. In all his years through war and peace, through decades of teaching teenagers and dealing with every kind of challenge life could throw at him, he had never imagined he would find himself on the wrong end of a police weapon on a quiet Tuesday morning in his own neighborhood. The surreal nature of the situation made him question whether he was having some kind of nightmare or medical episode. The final moments before the confrontation reached its climax seemed to stretch out like hours. Neighbors watched in horror as they realized what was about to happen to a man they knew to be harmless and kind. Mrs. Patterson was already reaching for her phone to call for help, though she wasn't sure who to call or what to say. David Chun was moving toward his gate, debating whether his intervention might make things worse or better. And Hank Mitchell, Korean War veteran, retired teacher, grandfather, and pillar of his community, stood facing a young police officer who was about to make a decision that would reverberate far beyond either man's imagination. The distance between them was only a few feet, but the gap in understanding and perspective seemed impossible to bridge in the crucial seconds that remained. Time seemed to slow down as Officer Torres's finger moved toward the trigger of his taser. Hank, seeing the weapon pointed directly at him, made one last attempt to defuse the situation. "Please, officer," he said, his voice carrying the dignity and authority of a man who had commanded respect throughout his long life. "I'm not resisting. I'm trying to cooperate. Just let me explain who I am." But Torres was beyond listening. The training that emphasized swift action and officer safety had taken over, and in his mind, every second of hesitation was a second that could cost him his life if the elderly man suddenly became violent. Without further warning, he pulled the trigger. The electrical current from the taser struck Hank in the chest, sending 50,000 volts coursing through his 91-year-old body. The veteran's eyes went wide with shock, and pain as his muscles seized uncontrollably. His faithful cane clattered to the sidewalk as he collapsed, his body convulsing from the electrical assault. Mrs. Patterson screamed from her porch, the sound cutting through the morning air like a siren. Davidson broke into a run toward his gate, shouting, "Stop! Stop! That's Hank Mitchell. He's not dangerous." But it was too late. The damage was done. Torres stood over the fallen veteran, his taser still in hand, as he processed what had just happened. The elderly man lay motionless on the concrete, no longer the perceived threat that had justified the use of force. For the first time since the encounter began, Torres really looked at what he was seeing: a frail old man in clean, modest clothes, lying unconscious on the sidewalk next to a simple wooden cane. Within seconds, neighbors were emerging from their homes, drawn by Mrs. Patterson's scream and the commotion. What they saw horrified them. Hank Mitchell, beloved neighborhood fixture and respected veteran, was lying crumpled on the sidewalk while a police officer stood over him. The scene looked like something from a nightmare, not something that could happen in their peaceful community. Torres immediately called for medical assistance, his training finally kicking in with the appropriate response for the situation he had created. "I need paramedics at the corner of Maple and 5th, he radioed, his voice betraying the first hints of uncertainty about his actions. "Elderly male, taser deployment, subject is unconscious." Davidson reached the scene and knelt beside Hank, checking for a pulse while glaring up at Torres. "This man is a Korean War hero," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "He's 91 years old and wouldn't hurt a fly. What the hell were you thinking?" The officer began to realize the magnitude of his mistake as more neighbors gathered, and their angry voices filled the air. These weren't the words of people trying to protect a criminal. These were the voices of a community defending one of their own beloved members. Mrs. Patterson was already on the phone with someone, her voice urgent and tearful as she described what had just happened. As the minutes passed, more details about the true nature of the situation became clear. Hank wasn't a threat. He was exactly what he appeared to be, an elderly veteran taking his daily walk to the corner store. The cane wasn't a weapon. It was a medical necessity that allowed him to maintain his independence. The entire confrontation had been based on a misunderstanding that had spiraled completely out of control. The paramedics arrived within 6 minutes, their ambulance screaming down the quiet residential street with lights flashing. As they worked to stabilize Hank and check his vital signs, Torres found himself facing increasingly hostile neighbors who demanded answers for what they had witnessed. The young officer, who had started his shift thinking he was responding to a legitimate threat, was now grappling with the reality that he had used a potentially deadly weapon on an innocent elderly veteran. But, unbeknownst to everyone gathered on Maple Street, Mrs. Patterson's phone call hadn't been to 911 or to Hank's family. In her distress and outrage, she had called her son Marcus, a Marine sergeant stationed at the nearby Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Marcus Patterson had grown up knowing Hank Mitchell, had listened to his war stories, and had always considered the old veteran to be like a grandfather to him. When Marcus heard his mother's tearful, angry description of what had happened to Hank, something primal and protective awakened in him. The Marine Corps had taught him many things, but perhaps none more important than the sacred duty to protect fellow veterans and defend those who cannot defend themselves. As his mother described how Hank lay unconscious on the sidewalk after being tossed by a police officer, Marcus felt a rage unlike anything he had experienced since combat. Within minutes of ending the call with his mother, Marcus was on his phone with every Marine he knew in the area. The brotherhood that binds Marines together, forged in training and strengthened in combat, activated like an emergency response network. Each Marine who received the call immediately understood the gravity of the situation and the need for immediate action. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to respond to Marcus's call. A decorated veteran of 3 deployments to Afghanistan, Rodriguez had never forgotten the debt he owed to the veterans who had paved the way for his own service. When Marcus described what had happened to Hank, Rodriguez's response was immediate and decisive. "We're rolling out. Give me the address." Corporal Washington was next, followed by Sergeant First Class Thompson, then Lance Corporal Davis. Each Marine who received the call dropped whatever they were doing and began preparing to respond. They weren't acting as vigilantes or seeking confrontation with law enforcement. They were answering a call to protect one of their own, driven by the sacred bond that connects all who have served in uniform. The network effect continued as each Marine contacted others. Within 15 minutes of Mrs. Patterson's initial call, more than a dozen Marines from Davis-Monthan were preparing to converge on Maple Street. They came from different units, different backgrounds, and different experiences, but they were united by a common purpose, ensuring that a fellow veteran received the protection and respect he deserved. As the ambulance crew worked to stabilize Hank, Torres found himself increasingly isolated among the angry neighbors. He tried to explain his actions, to justify the split-second decisions he had made, but his words fell on deaf ears. The community had seen what they had seen, and no amount of police procedure or protocol could excuse what appeared to be an unconscionable attack on a defenseless old man. The sound of approaching vehicles began to fill the air, but these weren't more police cars or emergency responders. These were the personal vehicles of United States Marines, converging on a quiet suburban street with a sense of purpose and urgency that only military personnel could understand. The brotherhood that had been forged in boot camp and hardened in combat was about to make its presence known in a way that would change everything about this situation. Officer Torres was about to discover that when you harm a veteran, you don't just answer to the law. You answer to every other veteran who considers that person family. And in 6 minutes, that lesson was about to arrive in full force. The first pickup truck rounded the corner onto Maple Street with purpose and precision that could only come from military training. Behind the wheel was Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, his jaw set in determination and his eyes focused on the scene ahead. As he approached, he could see the ambulance, the police car, and the cluster of neighbors gathered around where Hank lay on the sidewalk. Rodriguez parked his vehicle and stepped out, his bearing immediately recognizable as military, even though he was dressed in civilian clothes. At 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the confident posture of someone accustomed to command, his presence was instantly felt by everyone at the scene. He walked directly to where the paramedics were working on Hank, his trained eyes quickly assessing the situation. Within 2 minutes, a second vehicle arrived, then a third. Corporal Washington emerged from a sedan, followed by Sergeant First Class Thompson from an SUV. Each Marine moved with the same purposeful bearing, their civilian clothes unable to disguise their military training and discipline. They weren't running or shouting. They moved with the controlled urgency of professionals responding to a crisis. Officer Torres noticed the new arrivals immediately, and something about their demeanor made him uneasy. These weren't curious neighbors or family members. These men carried themselves with an authority and confidence that spoke of military training. As more vehicles continued to arrive, Torres began to realize that he was dealing with something far beyond a simple police incident. Marcus Patterson, the Marine who had initiated the response, arrived fourth and immediately went to his mother's side. Mrs. Patterson was still visibly shaken by what she had witnessed, and Marcus's presence seemed to calm her slightly. But as he looked down at Hank lying on the sidewalk, his face hardened with a mixture of grief and anger that his fellow Marines recognized immediately. "How is he?" Rodriguez asked the lead paramedic, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting straight answers in crisis situations. "Stable, but we need to get him to the hospital for evaluation," the paramedic replied. Taser deployment on someone his age can cause serious complications. His heart rate is irregular, and we're concerned about potential cardiac issues. The news that Hank's condition was serious sent a ripple of anger through the growing group of Marines. What had started as a response to protect a fellow veteran was now becoming a vigil for a man whose life had been put in jeopardy by what they saw as an unconscionable use of force. By this time, nearly 20 Marines had arrived on the scene, their vehicles lining both sides of Maple Street. They formed a protective perimeter around the area where Hank was receiving medical attention, their presence serving both as support for their fallen comrade and as a clear message to Officer Torres that he was now accountable to more than just his department. Torres found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. He was outnumbered by disciplined, angry Marines who clearly held him responsible for harming someone they considered family. Yet he was still a police officer with a job to do, and calling for backup seemed like it would only escalate an already tense situation. Sergeant First Class Thompson, a 20-year veteran with 4 combat deployments, approached Torres directly. His voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge of controlled anger. "Officer, I need you to explain to me how a 91-year-old man with a walking cane constituted enough of a threat to justify using a taser on him." Torres felt the weight of multiple sets of eyes on him as he tried to formulate a response. "I received a call about a suspicious person with a weapon," he began, but Thompson cut him off with a raised hand. "That weapon was a medical device," Thompson said, pointing to Hank's cane lying on the sidewalk. "That man served his country in Korea when some of us weren't even born. He earned the right to walk down his own street without being treated like a criminal. The Marines weren't creating a mob scene or threatening violence. Their discipline was too ingrained for that. But their presence was overwhelming in its quiet intensity. They stood in formation, their body language speaking volumes about their collective disapproval of what had transpired. Officer Torres was learning firsthand about the brotherhood that binds veterans together and the protective instinct that emerges when one of their own is harmed. Lance Corporal Davis, the youngest Marine present at just 22 years old, couldn't contain his emotion as he watched the paramedics prepare Hank for transport. "My grandfather served in Korea too," he said to no one in particular. "He told me stories about guys like Mr. Mitchell, about the hell they went through and the sacrifices they made. This is how we repay them." The ambulance crew was ready to transport Hank to the hospital, and several of the Marines immediately volunteered to escort the ambulance and stay with him at the medical facility. Rodriguez coordinated the response with military efficiency, designating which Marines would accompany Hank and which would remain at the scene to ensure that a proper investigation took place. As the ambulance pulled away with Hank inside, its lights flashing but siren silent in respect for the patient's condition, the remaining Marines turned their full attention to Officer Torres. They weren't vigilantes seeking revenge, but they were determined to ensure that accountability followed this incident all the way up the chain of command. Thompson stepped forward again, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led men in combat. "Officer, I want you to understand something. What happened here today isn't just going to disappear into some police report that gets filed away and forgotten. We're going to make sure that every veteran organization, every military family, and every elected official who represents this community knows what happened to Harold Mitchell." The power of social media and veteran networks was already being activated as Marines at the scene began documenting what they were seeing and sharing it with their contacts. Photos of Hank's cane lying on the sidewalk, images of the aftermath of the confrontation, and first-hand accounts of the incident were already spreading through military communities faster than any official report could move through bureaucratic channels. Marcus Patterson had contacted his commanding officer to inform him of the situation, ensuring that the proper military chain of command was aware that Marines were involved in responding to an incident involving police misconduct against a veteran. The military takes care of its own, and word was spreading rapidly through official and unofficial channels that a Korean War veteran had been seriously injured by inappropriate police action. Officer Torres was beginning to understand that this incident had grown far beyond his control or his department's ability to manage quietly. The Marines surrounding him weren't just angry citizens. They were part of a vast network of current and former military personnel who looked out for each other across all branches and all generations of service. The quiet suburban street had been transformed into something resembling a military operation, with Marines efficiently organizing themselves into roles and responsibilities. Some were documenting the scene, others were coordinating with the hospital, and still others were already working on ensuring that veteran advocacy organizations would be informed of what had happened to one of their own. As backup police units finally began arriving on the scene, they found themselves facing not a typical crowd control situation, but a disciplined group of Marines who were demanding accountability and justice for a fellow veteran. The blue line of police solidarity was about to meet the unbreakable bond of military brotherhood, and the outcome was far from certain. The arrival of additional police units created a tense standoff on Maple Street, with two very different types of authority facing each other across the sidewalk where Hank had fallen. Police Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the force, stepped out of her vehicle and immediately assessed the situation with the experienced eye of someone who had seen every kind of crisis imaginable. Morrison recognized immediately that this wasn't a typical crowd control situation. The Marines weren't an angry mob. They were a disciplined force united by a common cause. Their bearing, their organization, and their controlled but unmistakable anger told her that this incident had the potential to become a public relations nightmare for the department if not handled properly. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Morrison called out, having identified the senior Marine present through his bearing and the deference the other Marines showed him. "I am Lieutenant Morrison. I'd like to speak with you about what happened here." Rodriguez stepped forward, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "Lieutenant, one of our own was tasered while walking to the corner store with his cane. Harold Mitchell is a 91-year-old Korean War veteran who has never been in trouble in his life. Your officer treated him like a dangerous criminal for no reason that any of us can understand." Morrison turned to Officer Torres, who had been standing off to the side, looking increasingly isolated and uncertain. "Torres, give me your account of what happened here." As Torres began his explanation about the suspicious person call and his concerns about the potential weapon, Morrison could see the holes in his story and the poor decision-making that had led to this crisis. The lieutenant was experienced enough to recognize that Officer Torres had made a series of errors that had escalated a harmless situation into a potential public relations disaster. Using a taser on an elderly person without clear and immediate danger was questionable at best, and doing it to a veteran in front of his own neighbors was a nightmare scenario for community relations. Meanwhile, at Tucson Medical Center, Marines had established a vigil in the waiting room while doctors evaluated Hank's condition. The electrical shock from the taser had caused an irregular heartbeat that required monitoring, and his age made any medical complication potentially serious. Staff Sergeant Thompson had taken charge of coordinating with Hank's family, who were driving in from across town. The story was already spreading far beyond Tucson. Marine networks across the country were sharing the account of what had happened to the Korean War veteran, and veteran organizations were taking notice. The veterans of foreign wars, American Legion, and Vietnam Veterans of America were all being contacted by members who had heard about the incident and wanted action taken. Social media amplified the story exponentially. Photos of Marines surrounding the scene, images of Hank's cane lying on the sidewalk, and first-hand accounts from neighbors who had witnessed the entire confrontation were being shared thousands of times across Facebook, Twitter, and veteran-specific forums. The hashtag Justice for Hank began trending locally and was picking up steam nationally. Within hours, the story reached the desk of Congressman Miguel Santos, a former Army colonel who represented the district that included Maple Street. Santos had built his political career on veteran advocacy, and the thought of a Korean War hero being tossed while walking to the store with his cane made his blood boil. He immediately called for a full investigation and demanded answers from both the police department and the city administration. Lieutenant Morrison, recognizing the gravity of the situation, made the decision to place Officer Torres on administrative leave pending a full investigation. It was a move that didn't satisfy the Marines completely, but it showed that the department was taking the incident seriously. She also personally apologized to the neighborhood residents who had witnessed the confrontation, acknowledging that the situation should have been handled differently. The police department's Internal Affairs Division launched an immediate investigation, but they weren't the only ones looking into what had happened. The FBI field office in Phoenix received calls from veteran advocates demanding a federal civil rights investigation, arguing that Hank's rights had been violated under color of law. The incident was also being reviewed by the Arizona Attorney General's office and the local district attorney. At the hospital, doctors determined that while Hank had suffered no permanent physical damage, the electrical shock had caused concerning cardiac irregularities that required overnight observation. More troubling to his family and the Marines keeping vigil was the psychological impact of the incident. Hank, who had always been proud and independent, seemed confused and shaken by what had happened to him. When Hank's grandson, Michael, arrived at the hospital, he was met by a waiting room full of Marines who had never met his grandfather, but considered him family nonetheless. The sight of these young warriors showing such respect and concern for an elderly veteran brought tears to Michael's eyes and reinforced his belief in the bonds that connect those who serve. The media coverage intensified throughout the day as local television stations picked up the story. The image of a 91-year-old veteran being tossed while carrying his walking cane was powerful and disturbing, and it resonated with viewers across the political spectrum. Editorial boards began calling for accountability, and opinion leaders demanded reforms in police training and use of force policies. Officer Torres found himself at the center of a storm that was growing beyond his comprehension. What had started as a routine response to a suspicious person call had become a national news story about police accountability, veteran rights, and community relations. His decision to use his taser would be scrutinized by investigators, reviewed by attorneys, and debated by people across the country. The investigation revealed significant failures in judgment and procedure. The original call to police had been based on a misunderstanding by someone who didn't know the neighborhood, and Torres had escalated the situation instead of de-escalating it. His failure to recognize that an elderly man with a cane posed no real threat, combined with his decision to use potentially deadly force without attempting other options, represented a serious breach of police standards. 6 months later, Officer Torres was terminated from the police force and faced federal charges for violating Hank's civil rights under color of law. The civil lawsuit filed by Hank's family resulted in a substantial settlement and policy changes within the police department. New training protocols were implemented focusing on de-escalation techniques, particularly when dealing with elderly citizens and individuals with disabilities. The incident also led to broader changes in how police departments across the country approach community policing. The image of Marines protecting an elderly veteran from police misconduct became a symbol of the need for reform and accountability in law enforcement. Hank Mitchell eventually recovered from his physical injuries, but the psychological impact took longer to heal. The community rallied around him, and the Marines who had responded to his aid became regular visitors to his home. The bonds forged on that terrible Tuesday morning evolved into lasting friendships that enriched Hank's remaining years. The story of what happened on Maple Street became a powerful reminder of a sacred trust that exists between those who serve and those they protect. It demonstrated that when that trust is violated, there are those who will stand up to demand accountability, regardless of the cost. The Marines who answered the call that day didn't just protect one elderly veteran. They sent a message that echoed throughout law enforcement and military communities nationwide. Harm one of ours, and you answered all of us. In the end, justice was served not just through the legal system, but through the activation of a brotherhood that transcends rank, branch, and generation. The 6 minutes between the tossing of Harold Mitchell and the arrival of the Marines proved that some bonds cannot be broken, and some duties never end.